The snow fell without sound over the Smoky Mountain ridge, steady and indifferent, covering everything that no longer moved. A forest ranger almost didn't stop his truck. Then he sawed a smaller shape pressed against the debris, 3 weeks old, clinging to the chest of a mother dead for hours. At the Blue Ridge Primate Rescue Center, Dr. Owen Merritt placed 2 fingers against the infant's chest and felt the heart beating. But the rest of him had already begun to go somewhere else. What happened next would force Dr. Merritt to question everything he knew about grief and whether salvation could arrive from the most unlikely direction imaginable. It would arrive on 4 legs, with a coat the color of autumn leaves and eyes that had seen too much loss of their own. The Blue Ridge Primate Rescue Center sat 12 miles outside Asheville, North Carolina, on a wooded property that backed against the lower foothills of the Smoky Mountains. 8 staff members, 14 enclosures, and decades of accumulated knowledge working with Capuchin monkeys, one of the most psychologically complex primates outside the great apes. Dr. Owen Merritt had been its chief veterinarian for 11 years. His hands, weathered and unhurried, had delivered orphaned infants, set broken limbs, and made the unbearable decisions that come with any serious rescue work. He was not a sentimental man, but he stood at the enclosure door on the first morning and watched the infant Capuchin lying motionless on the heated mat, and something tightened in his chest that he could not name. They called the infant Jasper. The eye infection had progressed beyond the point of intervention. The damage to the corneal tissue was irreversible despite aggressive treatment in the first 6 hours. Jasper would not see again. But it was not the blindness that frightened Dr. Merritt most. It was the stillness. Jasper lay curled on his side, limbs drawn inward, his tiny fists closed against his chest in a posture that looked less like sleep and more like a deliberate withdrawal from everything outside his own skin. He did not cry. He did not reach when caretakers approached with a specially formulated primate milk that should have triggered an immediate feeding response. Jasper would turn his face away with a movement so small and so final that it felt less like refusal and more like a statement. The first attempt to bottle feed him lasted 40 minutes and produced less than 3 milliliters. The second attempt, conducted by Jamie Calloway, the youngest keeper on staff, with a particular gift for distressed infants, produced nothing at all. Jamie sat cross-legged on the enclosure floor for an hour, speaking in a low murmur, making herself as small and unthreatening as possible. Jasper's only response was to curl tighter. On day 3, the team introduced Cleo, a 7-year-old female Capuchin who had successfully served as surrogate mother to 2 previous orphans. Cleo settled beside Jasper, groomed the air near his face, made the soft, lip-smacking sounds that Capuchin mothers use to reassure infants. Jasper did not move. After 20 minutes, Cleo looked up at the observation window with an expression that experienced primatologists sometimes describe as evaluative, and then quietly moved away. She did not try again. By day 5, the weight readings required no interpretation. Jasper had lost 11% of his already critical body mass. His blood work showed advancing dehydration. His breathing had developed the shallow, irregular quality that Dr. Merritt recognized and did not like. Carol Bassett, the center's director, sat at the far end of the conference table and made the kind of decision that responsible rescue work sometimes requires. She said the word without flinching: euthanasia. Not as a desire, but as a consideration, the kind that becomes necessary when suffering has no visible path toward resolution. Dr. Merritt had no scientific argument to counter it. What he had was something considerably less defensible. He had watched Jasper's ear move toward recorded calls on day 4, not toward the sound itself, but toward the pause between one call and the next, as if the infant was listening not for what was there, but for what might come after. It was a small thing. It might have meant nothing, but Dr. Merritt had spent 20 years learning to read small things. He asked for 14 days. He gave Bassett nothing more than his own conviction that Jasper's stillness was not the stillness of a creature that had finished, but the stillness of a creature waiting for something it had no name for. Bassett nodded once. 14 days. Document everything, and do not let him suffer more than he already is. What found him came not from within the center's resources, but from a phone call he almost didn't make. A colleague mentioned in passing a dog brought into the Buncombe County Animal Welfare Shelter 9 days earlier. Something about the description stopped Dr. Merritt mid-sentence. He drove to the shelter that same evening. Copper was housed in the quiet wing. He was a golden retriever mix, broad-shouldered, with a coat the deep amber gold of maple leaves in October and eyes the color of old honey. He was 4 years old, and he moved through the shelter hallway with the unhurried, deliberate quality of a dog that had stopped being in a hurry for anything. The shelter coordinator, Sandra Pruitt, explained his history in the measured tone that shelter workers develop when they have told difficult stories too many times. Copper had belonged to Eleanor Marsh, 76 years old, a retired school teacher who had lived alone in East Asheville for 9 years. For 3.5 years, Copper had been the entire architecture of Eleanor's daily life, the reason she woke at the same time each morning, the warm weight against her legs each night, the presence that made a single-occupancy house feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. Eleanor died of a stroke on a Wednesday morning in January. Copper was found the following Tuesday, 6 days later. He had not left his post beside the front door. A neighbor found him lying on the entry rug, head on his paws, facing the door. His water bowl was within reach. It was untouched. At the shelter, Copper ate when food was placed directly in front of him, but only if a staff member sat beside him throughout the meal. He accepted petting from volunteers with the quiet politeness of an animal that understood social obligation but felt nothing behind it. He lay on his blanket with his amber eyes open and his gaze fixed on something that was not in the room. Sandra said that in 15 years of shelter work, she had seen dogs grieve. She had not seen one grieve like this. Dr. Merritt crouched beside Copper's kennel for a long time. The dog regarded him with those still, deep eyes, and his tail moved once, not a wag exactly, but an acknowledgement, the smallest possible gesture of recognition. Dr. Merritt thought about Jasper lying in his enclosure 12 miles away, listening for something in the silence between sounds. He thought about what happens when two separate trajectories of loss are given a reason to converge. He drove back and sat in his office until midnight. In the morning, he would do something that had no precedent in the center's 21-year history. The proposal did not go smoothly. Bassett described precisely everything that could go wrong. Capuchin monkeys were prey animals. Their threat response to canines was hardwired across millions of years of evolutionary memory. Jasper was already critically weakened. Any acute stress response could accelerate his decline faster than starvation alone. She was not wrong about any of it. Dr. Merritt acknowledged each point. Then he said that Jasper had 11 days left on the clock Bassett herself had set, and that the risk of attempting something unprecedented was at this point lower than the certainty of the alternative. One attempt, Bassett said. Full protocol. Immediate separation at the first sign of distress from either animal. The preparation took 2 days. They selected the center's small observation room, smooth walls, a thick woven mat for texture and sound absorption, 3 cameras at different angles. Doctor. Merritt collected Copper from the shelter and spent 30 minutes with the dog in the yard before deciding to proceed. Copper moved through the space with the quality that in a human would have been called discernment. He was not looking for threat. He was looking for something worth paying attention to. Back at the center, Jamie carried Jasper against her chest, feeling his heartbeat through her fingers. Doctor. Merritt entered first with Copper and let the dog investigate the room alone. Copper moved methodically, nose low, in concentric circles that gradually tightened toward the center. Then he settled not in a corner, not against a wall, but in the open center of the mat, facing the door. He lay down. He put his head on his paws. He waited. There was something in the quality of that waiting that made Ben Hartley, watching from the observation window, say quietly to no one in particular that the dog had done this before. Not this exact situation, but waiting, the particular kind that requires everything you have. Copper had done this before. Jamie placed Jasper on the mat in the far corner, 3 meters away. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Jasper was in his default position, curled tight, fists closed, face angled downward. Copper had not moved, had not acknowledged in any visible way that something new had entered the room. Then Copper made a sound. It was quiet enough that the observers at the window leaned forward simultaneously. It was not a bark. It was not a whine. It existed somewhere below both a low, sustained vocalization that had no precise name in any catalog of dog sounds any of them had studied. The closest description in Dr. Merritt's notes was a sustained tonal hum with slight melodic variation. Not communicating alarm. Not communicating need. Communicating if the word could be applied with any accuracy presence. The sound said, "I am here." Nothing more. Jasper's left ear moved, not toward the source, but orienting, searching, requesting more information. Copper continued. The sound remained consistent, unhurried, the way a river sounds when it has been running a long time. Copper began to move not toward Jasper, but in a wide arc, deliberate and slow, each step preceded by a brief pause as if to announce the change before resuming. He settled again closer, but not close, angled parallel rather than facing the infant directly. Then he extended one foreleg forward, not reaching, not offering. Simply present the paw available, the choice left entirely to the creature in the far corner. Jasper uncurled, one limb at a time. Over the course of 4 minutes, the tight defensive configuration that had been his entire posture for 11 days began to loosen. His legs extended, his fists opened, his face lifted. He began to move. "Doctor?" Merritt gripped the window frame and said nothing. Jasper moved the way infants move when navigating by sound and scent alone, each small shift a question asked of the environment. He crossed 1 meter, then another. He stopped 30 centimeters from Copper's extended paw and sat upright, which he had not done voluntarily since his arrival, and turned his face toward the sound. Copper had not moved, had not changed his tone, had not done anything that could be described as encouragement or invitation. He was simply continuing to exist, audibly, in a room where something small and broken was trying to find its way towards something it could not name. Jasper reached out, 5 fingers, smaller than a child's, trembling with the effort of the last 30 centimeters. They found the fur of Copper's outstretched paw and did not pull back. The room behind the observation window had gone completely silent. Jamie had one hand pressed flat against the glass. Doctor had said Merritt was crying, which he noticed only when the image in front of him blurred, and he understood the reason. He did not wipe his eyes. He was afraid that even that small motion might somehow reach through the glass and disturb what was happening on the mat. Copper lowered his head slowly until his chin rested beside his paw, not on Jasper's hand. Beside it, close enough that Jasper could feel the warmth without being held. The infant's breathing, rapid and shallow since the day he arrived, became slower, settling gradually into a rhythm that matched almost exactly the rise and fall of Copper's chest. They stayed that way for 20 minutes without either of them moving. When Dr. Merritt finally gave the signal to end the session, he realized that 2 hours had passed. It had felt like 20 minutes. In his notes that evening, he wrote 3 lines. The first documented Jasper's behavioral changes. The second noted Copper's positional sequence. The third line said, "Tomorrow we try again." The second session was quieter than the first, not because less happened, but because the newness had gone out of it, replaced by something that felt less like an experiment and more like a visit. By the 5th session, Jasper had begun initiating contact rather than responding to it, placing his hand on Copper's flank before the dog had fully settled. He had started making sounds of his own small chirps, brief and high, directed exclusively toward Copper. The team had never heard these sounds from Jasper before. They had the quality of invention, a vocabulary built from nothing, because the existing one had no category for what he needed to say. On the morning of the 17th day, Dr. Merritt arrived to find Jamie waiting outside the observation room, pointing at the monitor without speaking. Copper had moved himself during the overnight session to a position beside the feeding station, his body angled to create a narrow corridor between himself and the station's edge. Jasper stood at the entrance to that corridor, his whole body oriented toward Copper's shoulder, using the warmth and the sound of the dog's breathing as a fixed point from which to extend into the uncertain geography of the room. Copper made his low 2-beat contact sound. Jasper stepped forward. His hands found the edge of the feeding station. His face lowered toward the bottle. He drank. Not 3 milliliters, not a cautious taste. He drank for 4 minutes without stopping. When he finally lifted his head, his chin was wet and his ears were forward, and he placed one hand back on Copper's shoulder. As if completing a transaction he fully intended to repeat. Jamie was laughing and crying simultaneously, which caused Jasper's ears to swivel toward the window with an expression of mild offense at the interruption. Dr. Merritt took out his notebook, turned to a clean page, and wrote the date, the time, the intake volume. Then he sat down on the floor of the corridor and stayed there for a while. There was nothing else that needed to be said. What followed over the next months was not a steady upward line. Recovery never is. There were sessions where Jasper retreated, days when Copper carried his grief more visibly, lying quiet and heavy, his amber eyes fixed on something distant. On those days, the two of them would simply remain close and still, which turned out to be its own form of language. But the direction was unmistakable. Jasper began to climb onto Copper's back, which the dog accepted with the patience of a creature that had decided its purpose was structural as much as emotional. Over weeks, Jasper built a working model of his environment from sound, scent, and tactile memory. His personality emerged the way personalities emerge from underneath trauma irreversibly, with a particularity that caught everyone off balance. He was curious to the point of recklessness. He pulled Copper's ears recreationally. He had opinions about everything and communicated them in a vocabulary specific enough that Jamie began keeping a glossary. Copper endured all of it with an equanimity that experienced handlers described as philosophical. The dog had found his function, and his function suited him. A researcher from the University of Washington Primate Research Lab arrived in the 4th month and stayed 11 days. Dr. Rachel Voss had published extensively on Capuchin's social cognition and came with the measured skepticism of someone whose career had been built on not being surprised by animals. On the 8th day, she told Dr. Merritt that what she was observing did not fit any existing framework for interspecies interaction, and that she intended to say so in print. She described Copper's self-constructed feeding corridor as spontaneous assistive architecture. She had never used those two words together before. The story reached international media in the 6th month. Dr. Merritt explained the same events to different cameras throughout the fall. He was consistent and brief. He had tried something with no scientific basis, because he could not find a scientific basis for giving up. The rest of it, he said, belonged to Copper and Jasper. The second winter came to Asheville. Jasper was 8 months old with the dense, quick movements of a young Capuchin that had rebuilt its map of the world from nothing and trusted what it had built. Copper was 5. There was, on certain cold mornings, a stiffness in his first steps that had not been there a year before. Jasper noticed before anyone on the staff did. Jamie flagged a behavioral anomaly in November. Jasper had been slowing down on the approach to the water station. She initially attributed it to distraction. Then she watched the footage. When Copper's gait shortened on cold mornings, Jasper slowed to match it, not behind him, but beside him, one hand resting on Copper's flank at the same spot each time, where the dog's breathing was most easily felt. Jasper was reading Copper's pace through his palm and adjusting accordingly. He was not being guided. He was accompanying. The distinction was not subtle. Dr. Merritt watched the footage twice without speaking. Then he watched the footage from the first session, the woven mat, the extended paw, the 5 trembling fingers making their first contact, and watched that too, what had begun as a blind infant being navigated through a dark world by a grieving dog had become, without announcement, a grieving dog being navigated through an aging world by the creature it had once guided. No one had taught either of them to do this. No one had needed to. Copper was 9 years old when the silver finally reached his muzzle. He moved more carefully now, chose his resting spots with consideration, angled himself on cold mornings toward the light through the enclosure's eastern window. Jasper was 4 full-grown, alert, faster than Copper by a margin that increased each year and that Jasper managed as a simple fact. He moved at Copper's pace when they moved together. He had been doing this for 3 years. On a morning in March, when the last of the season's snow was still on the cedar branches, a young volunteer doing the early enclosure check stopped walking and stood still for a full minute. He was watching Jasper and Copper move together toward the water station, Jasper's hand on Copper's back, both of them moving with the unhurried coordination of creatures that had long since stopped noticing they were 2 different species. He took out his phone. Then he put it away again. Some things require more stillness than a camera allows. Dr. Sex. Merritt retired in the autumn of Jasper's 5th year. He sat on the bench outside the enclosure and watched Jasper groom the fur behind Copper's ears, the same spot where Eleanor Marsh had likely scratched him each evening in the house in East Asheville. He did not know if Jasper had found that spot by accident or by the same inscrutable process by which he had found everything else. He suspected the distinction did not matter. He opened his notebook to a blank page. He wrote the date. He wrote, "They are well." He closed the notebook. The snow had not arrived yet. The light on the ridge was the color of the last hour before dark. Copper lay with his head in the sun and his eyes half closed, and Jasper sat beside him with his face tilted upward in the particular way that blind animals orient toward warmth. Neither of them was going anywhere. Neither of them needed to.